Hey everyone, CWD Music Reviews here. I'm CWD and this is going to be a music review of the new Frank Ocean album, Blonde. This is the sophomore album of singer-songwriter, producer, Odd Future alumni Frank Ocean. And this album is following his acclaimed debut album, Channel Orange. That album was pretty intriguing for modern day R&B, and that was something that numerous critics as well as music fans have admired a lot in the past. It was pretty much his breakout project, and it set a platform for him to develop as much hype as a new project from Frank Ocean would. Even if me personally, I'm not that crazy about Channel Orange, I most certainly think it's a good record, but unfortunately I think the snippet songs, as well as maybe a good chunk of the tracks from the second half of the album, they don't really resonate with me as much as they could. Fast forward 4 years later, we have this new album from Frank Ocean, Blonde. It's actually following this visual album called Endless that he dropped just the day before, or the night before, this new album dropped. That was an interesting little 45 minutes, even though the visuals to me were pretty boring. I think the instrumental ideas were so varied and maybe a little unfocused to the point where I just can't help but feel like that this is more of a visual mixtape. When I heard Endless, I thought to myself that, yeah, I think this is going to be a teaser. I think he's just teasing music fans, and people have been waiting for a new Frank Ocean album for a while, and then he's just gonna drop something completely new out of nowhere. And that definitely was the case when he dropped this new album, Blonde. So I gave this thing a listen. I gave this thing numerous listens, and I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed with the results. As of right now, I think this is my favorite pop album of the year. This album's about 17 tracks in length, about an hour long, roughly the same as Channel Orange. And actually there are maybe a few similarities to this album and Channel Orange for that matter. For one, you do have the snippet tracks, but I think these are a bit more interesting than they were on Channel Orange. The length and maybe the accessibility of both albums are certainly there, even though Blonde is much more esoteric than Channel Orange was. I do like how Frank is definitely challenging himself in terms of experimentalism in his art, as well as just focusing more on creating standalone and interesting art than trying to push out hit radio singles. With that being said, that's also probably going to be a detriment to some people. There are no Thinking About Yous on this record, there's no Pyramids on this record, and that's going to be kind of impossible to promote via the radio, which is why I think he used the hype cycle to promote this record. He pretty much used the hype cycle and the unexpected album drop method in order to get this album as much attention and PR as it has now. In a sense, this album kind of reminds me of James Blake's new album in a way. The way it was so non-commercial and the music was just so vast and esoteric that the only way to be able to get it as much PR as it did was to just announce it a few hours before release and then drop it. I actually remember this interview James Blake had where he said that a lot of the songs on that new album, The Color in Anything, was influenced by what it is Frank Ocean was doing. And since, if you check out my review for that album, I wasn't that fond of the new James Blake record, that bred a lot of skepticism as to what Frank Ocean would drop in the future. But as mentioned, since I have now heard this record, I'm particularly pleased by the results. Now, in terms of instrumentation, in a sense it's nothing new from Frank. It's definitely within that alternative R&B range, that neo-soul range. I do like how he's expanding upon that style. All the while he's making quite a bit of experimental and more ballad-like shifts in sound that can make this album relatively difficult to market. Let's take the opening track, for example, Nikes. It's got this nice, smooth, slow and spacey, borderline ambient synth passage, as well as some wobbly bass in the background. There's like these up-pitched vocals, I assume coming from Frank, that actually sound quite pleasant. I don't think it sounds like annoying or too sharp or anything. There's a human element to what it is Frank is doing. In a sense, that reminds me of Kanye West, the way he's able to pitch shift soulful moments, and I think that goes off particularly well. I think if there's any artist that Frank Ocean is heavily influenced by, it's Kanye. The track just moves in this pace that really doesn't feel like it's 5 minutes in length. The track definitely keeps me occupied for the duration it goes for, especially when the up-pitched vocals kind of go and Frank's doing this rap sing thing that I think he does phenomenally better than Drake, and that guides the track out really well. But then there's the track Ivy, which is one of my favorite tracks, and it definitely demonstrates what a good chunk of the tracks here have, an organic neo-soul vibe. The way these watery and wavy guitar passages kind of create this really ballad-like atmosphere throughout the track. Frank's singing incredibly well over this song and numerous songs here. I guess this song being about the unrealistic realization of this moment where someone you deeply care for all of a sudden and says that they love you or anything of like that nature. Pretty much saying that he swore that he was dreaming when he heard that. But what really got to me and kind of polarizes me a little to this day when I listen to this track is this grouped vocal thing that actually sounded really intriguing to start with until the last note ends in this shriek that I'm not 100% sure whether to make heads or tail of at this moment. Before, it just kind of sounds like Frank is just breaking shit off in the background in the studio. It's a weird track. There's actually quite a bit of weirdness to this album. When it's not doing this organic neo-soul thing, it's definitely going for a more synthetic-ish vibe. Not so synthetic that it loses its human element to it. Kind of like what Kanye does. Kind of like what Bjork does every now and again. On the former note, you do have the track Pink Plus White, which has this really catchy piano refrain all over the track, as well as some really mid-paced beats going on. The vocal refrain is catchy as well. It's the same way you show me. Beyonce has some background vocals on this track, but like with Kendrick on the track Skyline 2, their contributions seem so faint that it could have been anybody. Once again with this album, like I mentioned, you do have like short snippet tracks on the record, like the track Be Yourself, which is probably my least favorite track on the record, if I can count it as one. It's just this little short, minute-and-a-half type interlude thing with what I can only assume is Frank Ocean's mother telling him, just be yourself when you go to college, don't do drugs, drugs just make you lazy and stupid and they ruin who you are as a person. But I think a moment that I find kind of humorous on the album is when the track after that solo he talks about doing acid tabs and all this other stuff, and it's a really beautiful jazz organ torch song ballad that I enjoy quite a bit. It's a standard length, about 4 minutes, but it feels maybe a little shorter than that, certainly. On the note of shorter tracks, the track Good Guy, which is one of my other least favorite tracks as well. There's not much to it, it's just more of a really stripped back instrumental snippet with Frank singing in this kind of lo-fi sense. There's not much to write home with about this track. You also have the track Facebook Story, which has electronic artist Sebastian, who actually has production credits on this album, just talking about how he and his girlfriend a while back split up because she adamantly wanted him to accept her on Facebook, but he said, oh no, there's no point in that. I mean, we live together, we see each other every day, what's the point of that? But she adamantly just goes crazy and breaks up with him for it. I think that says a lot about this age, certainly, and especially when it comes to jealousy and romantic relationships, how she really wanted to keep tabs on him, certainly, and the best way I felt like she was able to do that, despite the fact that they live with each other and pretty much spend every waking moment with each other, was to make sure she's following him on social media. And for a relationship to just crumble just because of that spoke pretty much volumes. It's not a favorite track of mine, but it leaves me quite a bit to think about. The track Close to You is kind of cool. It kind of reminds me of if Clams Casino produced a Boniver track with these kind of irregular and really attention-grabbing beats going on and these vocoder vocals that Frank is going for. Though I think the only short song on the record, the only snippet song on the record that I think is really good is Solo Reprise, which has my boy Andre 3000 rapping throughout the entirety of the track, and he goes in. I think another parallel that this album and Channel Orange shares is the fact that Andre 3000 is the best guest verse on the entire record, where he talks about buying a polo shirt and he pretty much cuts out the horse. It's just a patch of skin right there. He also takes a lot of shots at rappers that really don't write their verses. It's a pretty peculiar verse, and it gives me a lot to think about as I keep returning to this album. But to shift gears back to the tracks that actually have meat to them, we go to the track after Solo, Skyline 2. Amongst these tracks, if all the short tracks are cut out, this would probably be my least favorite track. The instrumental is just so laid back that it's hard for me to focus, fully pay attention to what the track itself is doing. Honestly, the track feels like a transitionary track and kind of a breather track for when the track Self-Control comes in, which is a pretty cool track, despite the fact that it has a Young Lean feature on this cut. But I think his contribution works particularly well. It's this nice, slow, jamish, solo electric guitar thing that Frank is singing over. There's some chipmunk vocals here, but it's done tastefully. I also like the off in the distance guitar solo that's on the track. It seemed pretty off kilter at first, to the point where I wasn't sure if I was gonna like it, but it grew on me with more listens, and I think it's definitely a standalone track. The track Nights is really weird. It's got some dulcimer, I think, or some kind of really interesting plucked string going on that I think is pretty cool. And this track is pretty much broken into 3 parts. You get this passage of the dulcimer and the regular electric guitar following the dulcimer, and this repeats before the beat takes a more upbeat pattern, and there's like these walls of synth that come in. The track just really picks up from there. I thought that was pretty interesting. Then all of a sudden the track kind of just drops, and then it goes into another passage, which I swore was another track. It goes into a more ballad-like piano vibe, and there's some really subtle rapping that goes on with this track as it pretty much just guides out. The most experimental track I could say that's on this record is the track Pretty Sweet. It has this like haphazard wall of strings just going all over the place, kind of just overbearing Frank's vocals for a minute. All of a sudden strings go away, but then you get these sudden group vocal flourishes out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden break beats come in. It really brings a lot of attention to the track, and it's actually probably the most liveliest track on the record, which isn't a bad thing. If there's one thing I do like about this album as a whole, it's consistently melancholy and ballad-like, even if there's slight variations through it. If you're someone that is going to be adamant about there not being a lot of variation to an album, this thing might not be for you. You might just like drift off into space listening to this thing. And I think that's what's gonna have a lot of people scratching their heads, since Channel Orange had quite a bit of variety to it and had traditional song structures to it. And this thing, though, it's just so weird and so off in the distance that it's not going to appeal to everybody, but definitely appeals to me. Moving onward, you get the track White Ferrari, which has an interloption of the track Here, There, and Everywhere by the Beatles, which I thought was really interesting. I think this is actually one of my favorite vocal moments Frank has on this record. The way this like really slow and ballad-like instrumental, it really creates a lot of tense and emotional atmosphere in a way, especially when you have James Blake contributing vocals. And there's this weird kind of noise rock or maybe some kind of heavy metal instrumental going off in the background, but so laid back and so just off in the distance that it creates, I guess, tension as to what it is this track could potentially do. The track Siegfried actually reminds me of Blame Game in the way it has these sung vocals going on as he's talking about, I guess, this lover or romantic interest of his just all of a sudden pretty much falling apart, and now he's left with just saying goodbye, and he was nothing but a thought in another man's head. The thing about this album in terms of lyrics, he's not really singing about anything too different from Channel Orange. He's talking about sexuality, race. He's nostalgic on this record, as evidenced in tracks like Be Yourself, Facebook Story, and the second half of Futura Free. But most importantly, he's still pretty melancholic over the fact that this man that he was in love with was never really that much into him and never really fully committing to this kind of relationship. Especially this refrain that guides the track out repeatedly, I will do anything for you in the dark. Then we get the track Godspeed, which is this gospel-inspired climactic finisher. It's not the last track, but it definitely leaves everything off on a nice climactic and incredibly emotional note. Whereas the actual closing track feels more like the credits rolling versus Godspeed, which sounds like the final and really dramatic scene to this really emotionally tinged and really unhinged record. The track Futura Free, the closing track, has these really dense synth layers all over this cut, and it has all these borderline auto-tuned or some kind of vocoder vocals. It really sounds like Frank is doing all these vocal improvisations, and that kind of annoyed me at first, but after listening to it, I saw what he was going for. Especially at a certain point where he just says, yeah, this track's over, you can change it at any point, but I personally never do. Given the fact that I think the latter half of this track, since it's a 9-minute cut, has a really moving sampling of some old adolescent interviews or something of that nature. And there's just something so moving and so heartfelt about the way this track guides out that I just can't ignore. Especially the interloped jazz organ thing that's on this track and a couple of the snippet tracks on this record. It's a very peculiar and very heartwarming ending there. So overall, yeah, this thing definitely lives up to the hype. In my head, I always thought Frank Ocean had a lot of room to improve, given the fact that I honestly didn't love Channel Orange, as well as me thinking that Channel Orange was full of more potential than it was fantastic songs. Here, he's definitely evolving artistically, and he's shown a lot of growth since 4 years ago when he last dropped Channel Orange. This thing is, like I mentioned, not going to be for everybody, given how consistently and cohesively it is ballad-like, given how really out there and really not catchy at the slightest on a good chunk of the tracks. He was going for something on the level that goes beyond just creating music to make a living. He definitely took his time with this thing. He definitely had a lot of ideas, and most of which came through quite a bit. Gotta say, it's probably my favorite R&B or pop album of the year right now. If you're into alternative R&B, if you're into neo-soul, maybe some hip-hop influenced things, you're definitely going to check this out. Frank Ocean had a moment to take the hype that was maybe starting to get a little stagnant, and maybe giving people the idea that he's never going to drop an album ever again, something to think about and something to enjoy. He had that moment to attempt that, and he pretty much succeeded with flying colors. This album is a plus 2.7 out of plus 3. I dug this thing quite a bit. It's not going to be my favorite album of the year. It's definitely within qualifications of being maybe within my top 10. But if you've given this album a listen, what'd you think of it? Did you like this album? Did you dislike this album? What was your reasoning for that, and what should I consider listening to and reviewing next? CWD Music Reviews here, signing off.